Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on making decisions in tough times. It's great to have so many of you on the call, so thank you for joining us today. My name is Josie Hinton and I'm Capacity Building Programmes Manager here at NCVO. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Alex Farrow, Lead Consultant here at NCVO. So, making decisions about the future of an organisation is never easy, taking into account the internal environment and the external environment, as well as recognising the assumptions we have to make as part of the process. The unprecedented nature of the current climate makes this process even harder. There are lots of unknowns, our environment is changing fast, and we are inevitably having to make decisions quickly. On top of this, we are having to work in new and very different ways. Despite these challenges, there are things that we can do to help us make the right decisions for the future of our organisations. So to help us with this, in this webinar, Alex is going to be covering the following. So he's going to give you a model to help you with different types of organisational decisions that you might be having to think about. To think about what you need to consider when making decisions. And then throughout this, we'll be giving you some practical tips for good decision making. We'll also be signposting you at the end to some useful resources. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, so do feel free to submit your questions as we move through the presentation. A final reminder before I hand over to Alex is that we are recording this webinar, and the recording, as some of you may know, will be sent to you afterwards, and it will also be on our NCVO Know-How coronavirus section on our website. You should have received the slides already. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Josie, and good afternoon, everyone. As Josie said, my name's Alex Farrow, and I'm one of the lead consultants here at NCVO. And my role is in supporting charities and voluntary sector organisations to think about the future in terms of their strategy, but also to understand better the impact that they're having. Very much two sides of the same coin. As Josie said, today we're going to be thinking about how to make good decisions during these very tough and, as Josie said, kind of unprecedented times. There are big choices ahead. Organisations are dealing with two big challenges simultaneously. There is the question of what is being delivered by our organisations, and then there is the question of how we're going to use our resources to deliver on that. Both things that are being stretched at this point, especially because of coronavirus. There are huge challenges that we face, whether that's funding, an increase in the need and demand for our services, and all of us are having to adapt and redesign the way in which we work and the way in which we deliver kind of our services and our programs to our users and beneficiaries. Many of us are responding to shifting to new ways of delivering in these very challenging times. Leaders, in the broadest sense of the word, some of you on today's webinar will be CEOs, directors of organisations, some will be trustees, others will be leaders of teams or departments or projects. Whatever kind of role you're in, leaders need to make really good decisions, both through the crisis, this immediate crisis that we're in, but also as we begin to emerge to whatever a new normal way of operating looks like. The first section we're going to look at on today's session is types of decisions. And to give us a framework, we're going to use this 7S model developed by McKinsey consultants, but utilised by many different sectors to help us think about the types of organisational decisions that may be required at this time. At the centre, we have shared values and purpose, and then around that, we have different aspects of organisational life that essentially help us to deliver on that. On the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk these through in more detail. But around the circle, you can see that we've got strategy, structure, and systems. And this top triangle is really about the structures and the processes that help us to channel our resources most effectively. This kind of bottom trio, we have staff, and also that could mean volunteers, many organisations will be purely run by volunteers, obviously both in terms of governance, but also those delivering projects and services directly to people. So staff also means volunteers as well. The skills and knowledge, and also the kind of leadership style that you might choose to adopt. This bottom triangle is very much around organisational culture, and this is where it might be more tricky to use those traditional levers of power that people have in organisations. The top things, strategy, structure and systems, lend themselves quite well to traditional kind of leadership decision making. Those at the bottom, it's more about the culture and the style in which we lead our organisations. So let's think about what these mean in a bit more detail and the kind of decisions that you might be facing around these 7 areas. So shared values and purpose, there might be decisions that you are making about your organisational purpose and direction at this time. And crucially, that shared purpose needs to be derived from or in response to the clear needs that are being the challenges and the needs and the aspirations of your users and your beneficiaries. And that might be different depending on whether you're delivering direct services or campaigning on their behalf. Those will be different ways of responding to those needs. But those needs may well have changed. There might be different people who weren't necessarily your beneficiary group before, but who now need the service that you're running. So what are those needs? Whose needs are they? How has that changed through coronavirus? But there will be decisions likely about where best to focus your attention in terms of your purpose as an organisation. Strategy, so clearly linked to that shared purpose. Strategy is the plan for how we will deliver and achieve that shared purpose that unites us. And there will be decisions coming up about your work, about the programs and projects that you deliver, about the relationships and the partnerships that you have with others. There will be big decisions around the resources that you have. Something we'll touch back on under systems, but it is clear that for many organisations across the voluntary sector, we will have fewer resources going forward. And so there will be questions and decisions about how we use our fewer resources most effectively to achieve our goals and make a difference to our users. Structure. Structure is very much about how we decide to coordinate those resources on a very practical level. So this might be how we decide to use our staff resources, our finance, our assets to be most effective. And going forward, there might be big decisions about how we restructure some of our organisations to in response to the changing levels of funding or resource that we might have, but also to achieve an organisational structure and design that is most effective to the situation that we find ourselves in now, which might be quite different to the structure that our organisations even had in February or early March, just a short 3 months ago, but so much might have changed. Systems. Systems is about those daily processes and procedures that enable us to work effectively as staff and as volunteers. So some of us will have made big decisions already about how we shift to a virtual working, how we ensure people have the IT that they require, that we have systems of signing things off or kind of interacting with one another that normally we might do face-to-face, but obviously we can't. But systems is also about finance. It's also about the systems underneath, and our financial and operating model is a core part of that system. And so there will be big questions that we face around making sure that we've got sufficient income, but also making sure that our organisations are sustainable, perhaps not in the next month or the next couple of months, but that we return to a sustainable model in the months and years ahead. Around staff, there will be big decisions around staff. First and foremost, how we support staff during this time of crisis. And the well-being of staff is something that we place huge importance of, as I'm sure all of us do on this webinar. But there will be decisions that we will have made around crisis management, things like furlough, how we adapt to building work around other responsibilities like childcare and caring responsibilities. But going forward, there are likely to be big decisions around the levels of staffing that our organisations can afford. And that will be a very tough process for many of us. Skills and knowledge. There will be decisions, or perhaps immediately questions rather than decisions, about our capabilities as an organisation to respond to the crisis. Whilst we might know that we need to adapt to a different way of working, both to work as an organisation, but also to deliver things differently, do we have the right levels of skills and the knowledge and the capabilities to be able to do that going forward? This might lead us to decisions either to upskill our staff, or we might also need to bring in new members of staff who have different skills that are now the skills that are needed. And finally, we have styles of leadership, the final S in our 7S model. And the leadership here, there are decisions about the culture that we as leaders, again, in the broadest sense of that word, that culture that we create. And this is around the ways in which we want to make those decisions and those choices. We'll come back to some tips around leadership throughout the whole of this webinar, but there is a clear role for leadership at this point around modelling behaviour, but also providing a hope, a bridge between where we are now and where our organisations need to get to towards the end of this crisis. So our 7 S's as a model to help us conceptualise where might the decisions be within our organisations that we need to be focusing on or taking at this point. I'm going to hand over to you now, and here we have a poll for you, and the poll in a moment will flash up, and I will ask you which area of those 7 S's is a priority for you right now. And we've grouped some of these together. So if shared values and that purpose and strategy is a priority, it's option A. Structures and systems, that channeling of resource, is option B. Staff, if it's is C. D is around skills and knowledge, and E is styles of leadership. So hopefully you can see the poll kind of flashing up, and it gives you a choice. So we'll give you a few moments. I think I've just noticed on the poll that's there, we seem to be missing the staff function, the staff option there. So if staff is also one of your big challenges, then probably group that under structure and systems. So let's put those together: structure, systems, and staff being that second option, skills and knowledge, and then styles of leadership under E. Great. So looking at the results that we can see there, so it's clear that for a lot of people on the call, 62% of people on the call have selected structure and systems. Not surprising, I think, in this time where many of the leadership decisions will be around choices around funding, the resource levels that we have, and difficult decisions probably around how we structure or restructure organizations in order that we can afford them, but also best structure them to respond to the needs around us. I'm imagining that quite a lot of that systems stuff that people have reflected is also around just the practicalities of how we run organizations when we can't meet face to face, when people have different levels of technology in their homes and different home lives as well. There's just a lot of stuff and decisions there about how we keep our organizations ticking over on a day-to-day basis, as well as those big structural challenges going forward as well. A clear second place there around shared values and purpose and strategy. Again, something that we completely recognize. Our theories of change and our strategies that we had in February or March, we probably need to let go of, because now the reality is so fundamentally different to the situation that we were facing in February, either through brand new issues that we now need to respond to, or an acceleration of those things that were always there but are now heightened massively. So clear that on structure and systems, there's a big challenge, but also on shared values and strategy. I will point out this at the end, but we have an upcoming webinar on kind of restructuring organizations coming up in early July. And so we will include some details about that as well. So thank you for participating there as well. It's really useful to hear how you are, the situation that you're in and the things that you are grappling with. We've got some top tips as we finish this part of the section. So around types of decisions, there's a few top tips that we want to offer you at this point. So around governance, it's really important that you check how you're constituted to make decisions to ensure that you make decisions that are legal and compliant. So some of this might be, there might be rules in your articles of association and your memorandum of understanding that might tell you how you can take decisions. The Charity Commission has released new guidance on allowing virtual meetings and digital decision making, even if it's not there in your original articles of association. But do check that to make sure that you're making decisions legally and compliant. It never helps. We know this as humans. It never helps to avoid those difficult decisions, no matter where we are and what decision we're making. But under times of stress, and this is something we'll come back to, our capabilities for decision making diminish. And this can lead us to avoid decisions or to make knee-jerk choices. Both we want to avoid. And in this way, this next one around being honest, we think it is better to be really open and honest and clear about the challenges and decision-making choices that you are facing as an organisation, especially with staff and volunteers. It is easier to be honest about the challenges, even if you're being open that you don't yet have all the answers, or that there are decisions that you can't bring everyone into those processes. Even though we are making decisions within a crisis, this doesn't mean that we lose all control. We can make good decisions that create a better organisation, even if it is a very difficult process that we need to go through. We can be intentional about the changes that we need to make because as humans running organisations, the world wasn't perfect in February, and neither was the way in which we ran organisations either. So we can make some positive intentional choices about changes that need to happen. We can also use scenarios to anticipate what might come up. Scenario planning is an excellent tool to anticipate what could happen and to prepare for it. It's not about a crystal ball and kind of predicting what's going to happen. I don't think any of us can do that at this point, or indeed at any point. But it is a useful tool, and we've got a link to this in the slides and in the email that will come later on, linking you to some of our updated guidance on scenario planning. And finally, I've already talked about February's plan, so I won't repeat, but how we might need to let go of the things and start again in terms of our strategy and our purpose. So this concludes this first section on the types of decisions that we might be making or might be faced with as leaders within organisations or groups and associations. The next section that I want to talk through is around how we make good decisions as leaders. Our main message here is that in times of great uncertainty, we need to break decision making down into almost the lowest level. So starting from the top, we're going to map backwards. So the starting point for decision making needs to be a very clear understanding of what decision it is that we need to take. This isn't about generalizing a challenge. So if our challenge or our issue is funding, the specific decision is what is the level of staffing that we can afford, and how are those choices going to be made. It is that level of clarity around the decision making that helps us to really do the rest of the process, as I'm going to talk through. Once we're clear on the decision that we need to take, we need to assess the time frame. How urgent is this decision? Is this days, weeks, or have you got months to make this choice? There will be many of us probably on today's webinar that are facing urgent decisions, urgent being days and weeks. But being clear on that will help to focus which decisions do you need to prioritize now, or which can wait until slightly later. We might need to consider at what level is this affecting us? Is this decision affecting our short-term viability or the short-term well-being of our staff or the needs of our users? Or is it a decision that is linked to our long-term future and our sustainability as an organization? Again, being clear is useful to know which decision should we be taking firstly. Underneath that is then what will help us to make good decisions. So asking the question, what will make this decision better? Linked to that is very much what information is required to inform this decision. And so this might be evaluation data, it could be financial data, it could be a good understanding of how our teams currently work and operate. Whatever data it is, you'll need to assess, do you have that data already? Is it data that you can get and collect meaningfully and that's appropriate at this time? Or is it information that you can't get and that you're going to need to make decisions without? It will be imperfect, this at the moment. All decisions will be imperfect. But this shouldn't stop us from trying to make good decisions based on as much evidence and experience as we can manage. We can also consider who needs to be involved and then how, crucially, this decision will be communicated. It might also be, particularly in the case of many trustee boards, that you might be making the decisions as trustees, but the implementation of those decisions will be a coordinator, or in larger organizations, an executive team or paid staff who will be implementing those decisions. So being really clear about what happens next with that decision is also quite crucial. So this is just almost a flow diagram, but framed as some questions to really help us be clear on the decisions that we need to make, and then some things to consider to help us make really good choices. Linked to this, we have some more top tips about what makes a good process. So when making decisions, we really advise against making decisions on your own. And the next slide I'm going to talk through will help us understand a little bit about why that's a bad idea. So where possible, make decisions with others, with the right others, but with others. And that might be with other colleagues in your organization, it might be with fellow trustees on a board, but making decisions as a collective is likely to stop us at making some of those knee-jerk decisions, but also it ensures that there is a diversity of thought and we avoid some groupthink that can get attached to single person decision making. As I said earlier, you're likely to be needing to make decisions based on what's available rather than what's desirable. So particularly in terms of the data and the evidence that you have. It will likely be that you won't have as good information, both in quality and quantity, as you had before. And we need to accept that there are limitations with this. Make decisions at the right level is crucial. In crisis mode, which if you are the kind of CEO or the director or trustees, you will have been in crisis mode. And you will probably have been involved in very granular levels of decision making. How are we going to communicate as a team is a really important one, but quite granular when we step back and we see the kind of decisions that we need to make now as a whole organization. Now is the moment to be pivoting away from crisis leadership to focusing more attention at the organizational and the strategic level, because there are decisions that can only be taken at a senior level or from trustees. Now is the time to move away from the decisions others can make effectively within your organizations. And finally, through this process, there were likely to be really tough choices about our organizations. We need to make these both with empathy to ensure that we have genuine concern and empathy for our colleagues, our volunteers, our users, and our partners. But our decisions do need to be purposeful and intentional. And we do need to be clear about the decisions with people, because that is in fact a way of supporting organisations or individuals through this process, is to be open and honest with them about what's likely to come. There's a reason why we're saying don't make decisions alone and make them with others. And this comes from some of the science that has explored different types of decision making. And there is a clear link in organizational science that associates high levels of stress that individual leaders or staff will be facing, and that is highly related to poor and unethical decision making. This isn't necessarily because leaders purposefully choose to make poor decisions. It comes from something called kind of allostatic load, which is essentially when the demands on a leader's or on an individual's internal resources, their time, their energy, their abilities, their capabilities, their attention exceeds that they have available. And what happens is they become overwhelmed. And what happens at that point is they stop focusing on the detail. They shrink the numbers of people who are in their circle of decision making, and they have reduced abilities to make good decisions. They're not kind of taking in all of the information and being clear about the choices that are ahead of them. All of us are under enormous personal and professional strain right now, and it is easy to see how people will become overwhelmed by the things that are demanded of them and the decisions they have to take. But if we are not careful, people will make decisions in a really bad position, and they will make poor decisions for the organization going forward. So some things to avoid this situation happening. Some of these seem really obvious and counterintuitive and perhaps a luxury, but we think they're really important. So crucially, it's really important that leaders take a rest. This crisis is going to be a long one, and the way many of you, I'm sure, will have been operating in the immediate crisis is not sustainable. If you don't rest, and it must be difficult to imagine stepping away from the organisation or the decisions at this point, but if you don't, you are more likely to take poor decisions. It is important for your organisation that you rest and that you take time to replenish your internal kind of capabilities to make good decisions. Even when it's difficult, even when people are exhausted and at risk of burnout, it's really important to listen to others and their perspectives, because it will strengthen the decision-making process. That allostatic load that I talked about earlier means that your mind will tell you to stop listening to other people. We have to try and override this as much as possible. We should break down decisions using some of the questions that I offered earlier, and we should find a coach. Now, this isn't necessarily a professional coach, someone you have to kind of pay to listen, but someone that you can confide in. This is probably someone external to your organization, but someone who you can be honest with and trust them, but also someone that you trust to tell you the truth and to challenge your thinking and to tell you if they think that you're getting this a bit wrong. This could be a partner, a friend, a loved one, a colleague in another organization. It might be a fellow trustee or a staff member and a trustee. Whoever it is, find someone to have some of these discussions and these conversations with, because for our organizations, and crucially therefore the beneficiaries that we are here to serve, it will make us kind of have better decisions as a result. So we've explored two different things here. We've explored types of decisions using our 7S model as a framework for thinking about those areas of decision making in more detail. And we've explored some questions about what under those 7 areas might be important for us to consider. We've also then thought about some of the things that make up good decision making, but also some of the vulnerabilities that we all face at this point that can tip the balance into us making poor decisions at this point as well. I'm going to leave it here with these 2 areas. And at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. And if you've got some questions, hopefully we've got some already, but if you haven't had a chance yet to add some questions, do type some into the question in the chat box that you see on your screen, and Josie will be helping to ask me some questions at this point. So Josie, I'll hand back to you.
Cool, thank you, Alex. I have to say, at the moment, we don't have any questions, so I'm really hoping that people do get onto that chat box and ask some questions. So just to kind of fill in a little bit of time, I've got 1 or 2 questions that I thought might be helpful for people that I've kind of thought up. So I just wondered if there were any tools that you could perhaps talk a little bit about, which would help people with that strategic planning process that you would recommend looking at, because as you said, people are going to have to be kind of ripping up the old strategic plan and possibly developing new ones.
Yeah, thanks Josie, and just kind of from me as well, do ask some questions. If you're thinking it, chances are a few hundred other people are also thinking it on the webinar. So do ask some questions to us. In terms of resources, we've got a few that I would pull out. So I mentioned earlier around scenario planning, which I find a really useful tool and one that I frequently use with organizations that I'm working with. And that it helps to imagine what might happen in the future, what could happen, and for us to think about how would we respond? What would the implications be for our beneficiaries, for our staff, for our organization, if these things happened? And we've got some great updated guidance on scenario planning on our Know How Nonprofit website, which we'll share as well in the link. There's also a great tool that was produced by NCVO quite a number of years ago, before I started here, called Tools for Tomorrow, which is a kind of a useful set of tools to help people think about some of the things that they'll be facing. So it might be thinking about different changes in needs. It might also be around helping to figure out what work you do, where does it add real value versus the cost perhaps of that service. It's a great set of tools that don't tell you what to talk about, but they give you a way to structure some of the conversations that people might be having. And I must say, I've been adapting quite a few of these tools online, using Zoom, using things like Google Jamboard as a way of essentially using the online space as a way of facilitating some of those conversations as well. So we can post a couple of those online as well, but lots of our guidance is available at Know How Nonprofit.
Cool, thank you, really helpful. Okay, so we have now got a few questions in. So I think one that's quite interesting is, what are good ways to balance consultation consensus with a more direct, I guess it's a more directive style of leadership where decision making is concerned?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we would always kind of advocate through much of our strategy work to find ways to consult people quite widely. I think the key thing at this point is to be really honest and open about the decisions that you're taking, but also the level of consultation that you're opening up. There will likely be parts of that strategy process, if you're restructuring or if you're going through a change in strategy, that it's inappropriate to open this consultation up, because it might be people needing to feedback or comment on the jobs and the roles of other people in the organization. And that, for us, we would think is a kind of an inappropriate level of consultation when choices about what we do so directly impact on the jobs and roles of people in the organization. So I think we would advocate just being very clear about who is taking decisions, and if you are asking people through consultation, be really clear about what are they being consulted on. Is this a process of feedback? Is it consultation? Are they being informed about choices, or is it feedback that will really be acted upon? So in what way are you asking the question, I think is really important. And there might be some decisions that only really the senior leadership team or trustees in the organization can make. And I think that the want to be open and consultative is good, but also there might be things that actually need to be decided by senior leaders in the organisation that it is inappropriate to ask a wider pool of people. So I think it's a really difficult balance, but I would recommend just being very honest about what the decision is, who's going to be involved, who will decide, how will that be communicated, and how it will be implemented.
Thanks, that's great. There are two comments here about, I think you mentioned fairly early on about the potential need for people to abandon their February plans, the plans that they had in February. And I think there are just a couple of comments that just kind of where people would like clarification on the value of doing that and the need for doing that. Maybe you can just explain a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm also seeing the questions come in, and I'm very much enjoying this kind of how does abandoning our plan help us at this time, which is a very good point. Now, and here I would separate out the specific aspects that are here. So I think there is a theory of change, which is our long-term articulation of how we see change unfolding over time, and that is a particular process that we do a lot with organisations to help them clarify their role and how they contribute to achieving change for people. What are the outcomes? What are the changes and the benefits that our work achieves or contributes to achieving? Contrast that with perhaps a strategy or a strategic plan, which is very much about what we'll do based on the current context that we're operating in and the very specific resources that we have available to us. So when I rather flippantly perhaps said abandon your plan, the theory of change might absolutely be correct and still valid. And that might be for many organizations a real guiding framework going forward as well, because it articulates the role and the way in which you will achieve change rather than necessarily the absolute specific projects and tasks that you will deliver as an organization. So that might hold up. What I would question, and I think it is a genuine question for organizations, is how well that strategic plan holds up that you had in February. Simply because from the evidence that we're seeing around us, we all know that the context has changed so fundamentally in terms of the external environment, the needs, the challenges, the realities for many of us. But also it's highly likely that our resources or our level of resources has significantly decreased. Some research that came out that was in The Guardian yesterday, but also based on our own research at NCVO, we had predicted that even just in these 12 weeks alone, £4 billion would be lost from the charity sector, from the voluntary sector in England. Now new research says that will be £10 billion lost before the end of the year. It is just clear, based on that alone, that the resources we have available will so fundamentally have shifted. Therefore, it is likely that the plan that we had ready to deliver in February might not hold up. But I do think that's an excellent point around theories of change. They might be a very useful framework to start thinking about how you might go forward. So if you're not quite clear yet on what resources you'll have or what's the priority to deliver, you might be able to articulate a really decent theory of change to give you some kind of guide and direction during a very volatile time.
Great. I think there are two questions. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm hoping we might be able to squeeze in two more before finishing up. So there's one question which I think is really interesting about how can we kind of know whether our decision-making process has been effective, i.e., and what might help us in the future to improve that process. I guess it's really kind of focused on feedback mechanisms.
Yeah, so this is actually a very difficult area of research, actually. So it is very difficult. There's lots of guidance out there about decision making or about strategy, but very little evidence about understanding whether they're effective or whether they're good processes, because it's often takes a number of years later to decide whether those decisions were the right ones or whether our strategies that we design were effective. I would say to focus on quite small level things and to focus on the process. So I would recommend check-ins in team meetings, for example. How are we doing? What works well in terms of the process that we're adopting at the moment? I think that's a great question for trustees to be answering or asking themselves regularly at board meetings. How are we doing? How well do we think we are doing in this process? And being very accepting of those dissenting voices. So enabling and fostering dissent and genuine curiosity if people are saying, I don't think we're doing this very well. So I think at this point, it's very difficult to get lots of structured feedback about these kind of processes. I would build them into regular meetings and check-ins so that people have a real space and opportunity to be able to vocalize some of their thoughts, because people are likely to be wary about giving so much unsolicited feedback at this point because they will recognize that leaders are under immense stress. I think it's incumbent upon us as trustees or as leaders in organizations to invite that space and being open to the challenge that people confront us with. And that takes a real level of humility and generous leadership, and something that can be difficult, especially if people are in that burnt out stage. So I think if you're asking the question, you have to be prepared for the answer. But I think it's a really good thing for people to continually check in on how this process is going. Josie, was there one more question?
Yeah, there was one. There are two questions that kind of have been submitted fairly recently, and I think they're important around how can we ensure that our kind of decision-making process is kind of equitable and kind of involves a diverse range of kind of audiences.
Yeah, that is a great question as well, and is really important that both the process and the outcome are mindful of those structural inequalities that exist within our organizations, but also in society. I think very practically, through the process, particularly if you're going through a restructuring process, I recommend things like equality impact assessments to see, is this process accessible to everyone in our organizations? And for many, working entirely virtually might not be particularly, so we might need to devise ways around the process. But we also need to ensure and recognize that the decisions that we make, we need to know if those are disproportionately affecting particular groups in our organization. And I think that's something to be very mindful of in terms of the process, but also in terms of the outcome, because there is a risk that we make poor decisions in this process. We have to build this in from the very beginning. So it is recognizing that all of us have these unconscious biases and that these will play out unless we build in checks and balances to override those unconscious biases that exist as we go through high level, rapid, significant decision-making processes, but also that we then understand if we've made some decisions, what is the impact on particular groups within our organization? How do we make sure that particular groups are not disproportionately affected? We can try and link to some additional resources to help with this as well.
Great, thank you, Alex. I think that's all been really helpful, and I'm sorry we haven't managed to get through any more of the questions. But as Alex has mentioned, we are going to be sending a follow-up email with some hopefully useful signposting information. Just a quick reminder, I'm aware we're running 1 minute over time, but just very quick reminder before we close this webinar. So the scenario planning guidance that Alex mentioned, and as well as a lot of other guidance and tools and resources, are all on our NCVO know-how site, and everything is open to everyone at the moment, so please do go and check that out. As Alex mentioned, we do have some upcoming webinars and we have more in the pipeline, so do keep an eye on our NCVO training platform. Our next webinar is on building organizational resilience, and we're doing that as part of Small Charities Week, as NCVO are leading on Policy Day. So do hope some of you will join us then. As we've already mentioned, we are going to be sending out the recording and some signposting information. And then last but not least, we've continued throughout our kind of coronavirus webinar series to ask for your feedback and any suggestions you have for future topics that you would like us to discuss. So please do, if you have the chance, do complete our SurveyMonkey questionnaire, which will be sent out to you along with the other resources. Thank you again for joining us today, and hope you found it useful, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Many thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.